Sometimes the deepest loneliness comes not from being alone, but from being forgotten by time itself. For 8 centuries, the vampire lord Kael has watched the world change while he remains trapped in endless night, ruling over empty halls where laughter once echoed. In bitter jest, he declares he will mate with the first woman who enters his cursed castle before the blood moon. He expects no one to come. But when his great doors finally open, it is not a young maiden who steps inside. Instead, Elfrida arrives, a weathered healer in her 50s, with silver hair and steady hands, seeking shelter from the storm. She fears nothing, not even him. What happens when someone who has given up on love meets someone who refuses to give up on life? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The iron bell's deep, resonant toll echoed through the valley. Like a funeral dirge, its voice carrying secrets that had slumbered for 3 centuries. In the highest tower of Castle Ravencrest, Kael Shadowmere felt the vibration in his bones, a sensation he had not experienced since the last Great War, when mortals still dared approach his domain. The ancient bell had been forged in an age when hope still walked among men, when its bronze surface bore blessings from priests who believed their god could protect the innocent from creatures like him. Now it sang again, and he wondered what fool had come to die in his mountains. Elfrida Thornwick pulled her weathered leather medical satchel closer to her chest as lightning illuminated the twisted path ahead. The storm had caught her between villages, and the old shepherd's directions had led her deeper into the cursed woods than any sensible woman would venture. But sense had long since abandoned her 27 years of tending battlefield wounds, plague victims, and dying children had taught. For that, safety was an illusion, comfort, a luxury she could not afford. Her boots squelched in the muddy earth as she pressed forward, guided by the distant glow of windows that seemed to float like malevolent eyes in the darkness. The satchel at her side contained everything she had salvaged from the last war. Bone needles, dried herbs wrapped in oilcloth, bottles of distilled spirits for cleaning wounds, and a small fortune in rare medications she had bartered for with desperate merchants. It was her life's work, reduced to what one aging woman could carry on her shoulders. The trees around her seemed to lean inward, their branches forming a canopy so thick that even the storm's fury felt muffled here. Ancient oaks twisted into unnatural shapes, their bark scarred with symbols she did not recognize. Elfrida had seen enough of death to recognize its presence, and these woods reeked of old violence, old sorrow. Yet she pressed on, because turning back meant certain death in the storm, and she had faced worse odds with less hope. Castle Ravencrest rose from the mountainside like a growth of black stone, its towers piercing the storm clouds. The architecture spoke of different eras, Norman fortifications built upon Roman foundations, with Gothic additions that reached toward heaven like desperate prayers. Gargoyles perched on every corner, their faces worn smooth by centuries of rain, but their eyes seemed to follow her approach. The massive oak doors, reinforced with iron bands that had rusted to the color of dried blood, stood open just wide enough for a person to slip through. Elfrida paused at the threshold, water streaming from her grey hair and practical woolen cloak. The satchel's leather straps had worn grooves in her shoulders over the years, marking her as surely as any brand. Inside, she could hear the whisper of her own breathing echoing in vast spaces. Candles flickered in iron sconces along stone corridors that stretched into shadow. The air carried scents of old wood, melted wax, and something else, something that reminded her of the metallic tang that lingered after lightning strikes. She stepped inside. The doors closed behind her with a sound like fate sealing itself, and she found herself standing in a great hall that could have housed her entire village. Tapestries hung from the walls, their colors faded, but their craftsmanship exquisite. They depicted scenes of courtly life, from ages past, knights and ladies dancing, feasts laid out on tables, groaning under their weight, children playing in gardens where roses bloomed eternal. But dust covered everything, and the silence felt heavy with abandonment. "You are either very brave or very foolish." The voice emerged from the shadows near the great fireplace, cultured and resonant with an accent she could not place. Elfrida turned slowly, her hand instinctively moving to the small knife she kept for cutting bandages. What stepped into the candlelight made her breath catch, but not from fear. Kael's shadow mirror appeared to be a man in his prime, perhaps 40 years of age, with dark hair that curled just past his collar and eyes the color of storm clouds. His face bore the kind of angular handsomeness that belonged in the tapestries around them, but there was something in his bearing that spoke of weight, not physical, but the accumulated burden of too many years, too many decisions, too much solitude. He wore simple clothes of fine quality, a linen shirt open at the collar, dark trousers, boots that had seen decades of wear but remained supple as silk. "I am neither," Elfrida replied, setting down her satchel and shaking water from her cloak. "I am simply caught in a storm and seeking shelter. If hospitality is too much to ask, I will settle for a dry corner until the weather passes." Her directness seemed to surprise him. Kael had expected trembling, perhaps tears, certainly some recognition of what he was. Instead, this grey-haired woman with mud on her boots regarded him with the steady gaze of someone who had seen enough of the world's horrors to be unimpressed by one more. "You know what this place is," he said, moving closer but keeping the massive oak table between them. "You know the stories they tell in the villages." "I know that stories grow in the telling," Elfrida answered, wringing water from her cloak with practiced efficiency. "I know that every village needs its monster to explain why bad things happen to good people. And I know that this castle has been here longer than any of the tales they tell about it." Kael studied her face in the flickering candlelight. Lines mapped the geography of her years, laugh lines around intelligent brown eyes, worry lines across her forehead, the deeper grooves that spoke of grief carried and burdens shouldered. Her hands moved with the confidence of someone accustomed to life and death decisions, steadying herself against the table as she pulled off her muddy boots. "You are not what I expected," he admitted. "And what did you expect?" Elfrida asked, though there was curiosity rather than challenge in her voice. Kael's expression grew distant. "Someone young, someone beautiful by the standards of your kind, someone who would scream when they learned what I am, what this place has become in my keeping. I stopped screaming at things I could not change many years ago," Elfrida said quietly. "It wastes breath better used for solving problems." The simplicity of her words hit him with unexpected force. For 8 centuries, he had imagined this moment, had crafted elaborate scenarios where terrified maidens would stumble into his domain, where he would either feast or play the genteel host depending on his mood. He had never imagined standing in his ancestral hall discussing practicality with a woman who looked at him the way a physician might examine a particularly interesting case. "The storm will last through the night," Kael said. "Finally. You are welcome to shelter here until it passes. Thank you." Elfrida's acceptance came without effusive gratitude or nervous chatter. She simply picked up her satchel and looked around the hall with the assessing gaze of someone calculating the best place to wait out a difficult situation. "I have some food in my pack if you are hungry. Travel rations, but filling enough." The offer of shared provisions struck Kael as absurdly normal. When had anyone last offered him food? When had he sat down to a simple meal with another person? The memories felt so distant they might have belonged to someone else entirely. "I do not require sustenance," he said carefully. "As you wish." Elfrida moved toward the fireplace, where embers still glowed among the ashes. "Might I add wood to this? The storm has chilled me more than I expected." "Of course." He watched her tend the fire with movements that spoke of countless nights spent in temporary shelters, countless times when survival had depended on her ability to coax warmth from reluctant flames. She arranged the kindling with the same methodical care she might use to set a broken bone, building the fire layer by careful layer until bright flames began to chase away the shadows. "How long has it been since someone else sat by this fire?" she asked, settling onto a worn cushion near the hearth. "I cannot remember," Kael answered honestly. Something in his tone made her look up at him more carefully. "You have lived here alone for a very long time, longer than you might believe." Elfrida considered this, pulling her knees up and wrapping her arms around them in a gesture that made her look younger than her years. "Loneliness is a particular kind of wound. I have seen it in soldiers who survived when their companions did not, in mothers who outlived their children, in people whose circumstances set them apart from the ordinary fellowship of their neighbors." "And what is your cure for such wounds?" Kael asked, drawn despite himself into conversation. "Time, patience, the willingness to risk caring again, even when experience teaches us that all things pass." She gazed into the flames thoughtfully. "But mostly, I have learned that loneliness is not cured by the presence of others, but by the courage to be present with others, to be genuinely seen, and to see genuinely in return." Her words carried the weight of hard-won wisdom, and Kael found himself studying her profile as she watched the fire. There was something compelling about her stillness, her lack of pretense. She did not fill the silence with nervous chatter or try to charm him with flattery. She simply existed in the moment, comfortable with herself, and apparently with him. "What brought you to these mountains?" he asked. "The last village's healer died of the wasting fever 3 months ago," Elfrida explained. "I came to help where I could, but there was little I could do. The disease had taken too strong a hold. When it passed, I decided to travel on rather than stay, where every face reminded me of my failure." "You blame yourself for deaths you could not prevent?" "I blame myself for the deaths I might have prevented if I had been wiser, faster, more skilled." She turned to look at him directly. "Do you not carry similar regrets?" The question hit closer to truth than she could know. Kael's long existence was built upon a foundation of regrets, choices that could not be undone, consequences that stretched across centuries. But he had grown accustomed to bearing them alone, and her casual acknowledgement of shared suffering felt like a door opening onto possibilities he had forgotten existed. "I carry many regrets," he said finally. "Then we have something in common." Elfrida smiled, and the expression transformed her face entirely. It was not the practiced smile of youth seeking to please, but the genuine warmth of someone who had found unexpected kinship. "Perhaps the storm has done us both a service by bringing us together, even briefly." Outside, thunder rolled across the mountains like the footsteps of giants, and rain lashed the ancient windows with increasing fury. But inside, by the fire's warm glow, 2 solitary souls had found something neither had expected, the simple, profound comfort of being understood. Kael looked at this remarkable woman who had walked into his cursed domain without fear, who offered food and wisdom and companionship as naturally as breathing, and felt something stir within him that had been dormant for so long he had forgotten its name: hope. As the night deepened, the storm outside reached a crescendo that seemed to shake the very foundations of the ancient castle. But it was not the thunder that woke Elfrida from her doze by the dying fire, it was the sudden, eerie silence that followed. She opened her eyes to find the great hall bathed in an otherworldly crimson glow that seeped through the tall windows like spilled blood. The blood moon had risen. Across the hall, Kael stood motionless before one of the arched windows, his silhouette etched against the scarlet light. Around his neck something glowed with the same deep red radiance, a pendant she had not noticed before, its surface pulsing like a heartbeat. The blood moon pendant, ancient and terrible, hung from a chain of tarnished silver, and its awakening meant that words spoken in jest had become binding truth. "What is that?" Elfrida asked, rising slowly from her place by the hearth. Kael's shoulders tensed at her voice. He had hoped she would sleep through this moment, that he might find some way to break the supernatural bonds before she discovered what his careless declaration had wrought. But the pendant's glow was unmistakable, and there was no hiding from what he had brought upon them both. "A relic from darker times," he said without turning. "A reminder that some words once spoken cannot be taken back." Elfrida moved closer, her free, healer's instincts alert to the tension radiating from his frame. The pendant's light reflected in his dark hair, casting strange shadows across his face. She had seen enough magical artifacts during her years of travel to recognize power when it manifested, and this thing around his neck thrummed with ancient force. "You spoke of taking a mate," she said quietly, before the blood moon rose. "A jest born of centuries of solitude," Kael replied, his voice heavy with regret. "I never imagined anyone would actually come. I certainly never imagined." He turned to face her then, and she saw anguish in his storm-grey eyes. "I never imagined someone like you." The pendant pulsed brighter as their gazes met, and Elfrida felt something shift in the air between them, not quite magic, not quite magnetism, but something that made her skin tingle and her pulse quicken. It was as if invisible threads had begun to weave themselves around them, binding their fates together with each passing moment. "What does it mean?" she asked, though part of her already knew. "It means that my words have become a supernatural covenant," Kael explained, his voice barely above a whisper. "The pendant responds to blood moon magic, and it has deemed my declaration binding. You are now bound to me, as I am bound to you, until the cycle completes." Elfrida absorbed this information with the same calm pragmatism she brought to setting broken bones or treating fever. She studied the pendant's hypnotic glow, then looked up at Kael's face, at the guilt and worry etched in his features, at the way he held himself as if expecting her to flee in terror. "And what form does this binding take?" she asked. "I am not entirely certain," Kael admitted. "The magic is older than my own transformation. But traditionally, such bonds were meant to unite souls across the barriers of mortality and death. They were forged to last beyond the span of human life." "You speak as if human life is something separate from your own," Elfrida observed. "What are you, exactly?" The question hung in the air between them like a blade. Kael had danced around the truth all evening, allowing her to interpret his words as metaphor or eccentricity. But the pendant's awakening had stripped away that luxury. The blood moon's light revealed him for what he truly was, and there could be no more pretense. "I am vampire," he said simply. "The first of my kind in this realm, though not by choice. I have walked this earth for 8 centuries, sustained by blood and cursed with immortality." Elfrida nodded, as if he had told her he was a blacksmith or a merchant. "That explains the pale complexion and the way you move, too fluid for a mortal man. It also explains why the stories persist despite their obvious exaggeration." Her matter-of-fact acceptance stunned him. "You are not afraid?" "Should I be?" Elfrida asked in return. "You have shown me nothing but courtesy. You offered shelter without price, allowed me to tend your fire, listened to my stories without judgment. If you meant me harm, you have had ample opportunity." "But I am a monster," Kael said, and there was pain in his voice, centuries of self-loathing condensed into those few words. "You are a man cursed with a monstrous condition," Elfrida corrected gently. "I have seen the true monsters of this world, men who chose cruelty when kindness was possible, who took pleasure in suffering they could have prevented. You carry yourself like someone who regrets what he has become, not someone who revels in it." The pendant flared brighter at her words, and both of them gasped as a wave of connection passed between them. For a moment, Elfrida glimpsed the weight of his loneliness, 800 years of isolation, of watching the world change while remaining forever apart from it. And Kael felt the steady strength of her spirit, decades of choosing compassion over cynicism, of healing rather than harming, of moving forward despite loss. "The binding grows stronger," Kael said, his voice rough with emotion. "With each moment of understanding between us, the magic deepens." "Then perhaps we should understand what we are choosing," Elfrida said practically. "What would it mean to honor this bond? What would it require of both of us?" Kael moved closer to the fire, and she could see the conflict playing across his features. "It would mean accepting a life beyond the span of normal mortality. The magic would change you, slowly but inevitably, granting you years to match my own. It would mean binding yourself to someone whose very nature requires sustenance that most would find abhorrent. And what would it require of you?" "To trust," Kael said simply. "To open my heart again after centuries of protecting it. To risk caring for someone who might grow to despise what I am, what I must do to survive." Elfrida considered this as she might weigh the risks and benefits of a complex surgical procedure. "Your sustenance, must it involve killing?" "Not necessarily," Kael admitted. "I have learned to take only what I need, and only from those who can spare it. I do not kill unless I must defend myself or others." "Then it is not so different from any other difficult medical requirement," Elfrida mused. "I have treated conditions that required unpleasant remedies, diets that seemed impossible to maintain, treatments that appeared worse than the disease itself." Her clinical approach to his vampirism was so unexpected that Kael almost laughed, despite the gravity of their situation. "You would truly consider binding yourself to such a life?" "I would consider binding myself to such a man," Elfrida said, meeting his gaze steadily. "Your condition is part of you, but it is not the whole of you. I have seen enough of both suffering and joy to know that meaning comes not from the circumstances of our existence, but from how we choose to meet them." The pendant pulsed again, and this time the connection between them felt less like magic and more like recognition. Two souls, acknowledging their compatibility across the vast differences in their natures. Kael felt something he had thought lost forever. The possibility of genuine partnership, of sharing his burden with someone strong enough to bear it. "There would be dangers," he warned, "others of my kind, who might see our bond as weakness or betrayal. The constant need for vigilance, for protecting not just myself but you as well." "I have lived with danger for most of my adult life," Elfrida replied calmly. "Battlefields, plague houses, political upheavals. Survival has always required vigilance and partnership with those I trust." The blood moon reached its zenith outside, and the pendant's glow reached its peak intensity. In that moment of maximum magical power, they both felt the binding settle into place with an almost audible click, not a imprisonment, but a choice made manifest in supernatural reality. "Then we are bound," Kael said softly. "For better or worse, until this magic finds its natural conclusion." "We are bound," Elfrida agreed. "And now we must learn what manner of life we can build together within these strange constraints." Outside, the blood moon began its slow descent toward the horizon, but its work was done. The pendant around Kael's neck had woven their fates together with threads of ancient magic and mutual understanding. Whatever came next, they would face it as partners in the truest sense, two solitary souls who had found, against all odds, exactly what they needed in each other. The storm had passed, but their real journey was just beginning. The morning after the blood moon brought an unusual quiet to Castle Ravencrest. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows in golden shafts, illuminating dust motes that danced like tiny spirits in the still air. Elfrida woke to find herself covered with a wool blanket she did not remember pulling over herself, and the fire had been carefully tended through the night to keep the chill at bay. Kael stood in the shadows near the great staircase, avoiding the direct sunlight, but watching her with an expression she could not quite decipher. There was something different about him in the daylight hours, not weakened, as the stories often claimed about his kind, but quieter, more introspective, as if the night's revelations had settled into his bones like an old ache. "I trust you slept well," he said, his voice carrying the formal courtesy of centuries past. "Better than I have in weeks," Elfrida admitted, stretching muscles stiff from sleeping on cushions. "Thank you for the blanket and for tending the fire. It seemed the least I could do, given our changed circumstances." Kael gestured toward the staircase. "Perhaps you would like to see more comfortable accommodations? The guest chambers have not been used in many years, but they can be made suitable." Elfrida gathered her medical satchel and followed him up the winding stone steps. The staircase was wide enough for several people to walk abreast, its banister carved with intricate designs that told stories of hunts and feasts and celebrations from ages past. The stone was worn smooth by countless hands, countless footsteps, countless lives that had passed through these halls when the castle had been home to a living family rather than a solitary immortal. The guest wing stretched along the castle's eastern face, where morning light could flood through tall windows and chase away the shadows. Kael led her to a chamber that faced the mountains, its windows offering a view of forest and sky that took her breath away. The room itself was spacious but simple, a large bed with carved posts, a writing desk positioned to catch the light, chairs arranged near the fireplace, and a wardrobe that could house the belongings of a dozen women. "This was my sister's room," Kael said quietly as Elfrida set down her satchel on the writing desk. "Before, she married and moved to her husband's estate. That was 7 centuries ago, but I have kept it as she left it." Elfrida moved to the wardrobe and opened its doors to reveal gowns of silk and velvet, their colors still rich despite their age. The clothing spoke of wealth and status, but also of a young woman's joy in beautiful things. There were riding habits for hunting expeditions, elegant gowns for court functions, and simpler dresses for everyday wear. Each garment had been carefully preserved, wrapped in linen and scented with herbs that had kept moths and decay at bay. "She was important to you," Elfrida observed, running her fingers over the fabric of a deep blue gown. "She was the last link to my humanity," Kael admitted. "When she died of old age in her bed, surrounded by grandchildren, I felt the final thread connecting me to mortal life snap. I had watched from a distance as she lived and loved and grew old, and when she was gone, I realized I had become something entirely apart from the world I once knew." The pain in his voice drew Elfrida's attention away from the gowns. She turned to study his face, noting the way his jaw tightened with the effort of containing centuries of grief. Without conscious thought, she moved closer and placed her hand gently on his arm. "Tell me about her," she said. The simple request seemed to surprise him. "You would want to hear about someone you never met? I want to understand what shaped the man I find myself bound to," Elfrida replied. "Your sister was clearly a significant part of that shaping." Kael moved to the window, gazing out at the mountains where morning mist still clung to the peaks. "Liana was 3 years younger than I was when we were mortal. She had our mother's gift for laughter and our father's stubborn streak. She could charm birds from trees and argue philosophy with the court scholars in the same afternoon." As he spoke, Kael moved to the wooden chest that sat at the foot of the bed. With careful reverence, he opened it to reveal a collection of objects that seemed to glow with the warmth of memory. There were letters tied with faded ribbon, a silver hairbrush with mother-of-pearl inlay, a small portrait painted on ivory, and beneath it all, wrapped in silk, a carved wooden box no larger than Elfrida's hand. "She sent me letters, even after I became what I am," Kael continued, lifting the bundle of correspondence. "At first, they were filled with concern. She wanted to help me find a cure, to bring me back to the family. Later, They became updates about her children, her husband's work, the small joys and sorrows that make up a human life. Elfrida picked up the miniature portrait and found herself looking at a young woman with Kael's storm-grey eyes and dark hair. But where his expression carried the weight of too much knowledge, Lyanna's painted face radiated the kind of joy that comes from believing the world holds more good than ill. "She's beautiful," Elfrida said softly. "She wrote to me until 2 weeks before her death," Kael said, his voice growing thick with emotion. "Her final letter thanked me for watching over her family from afar, for the mysterious gifts that appeared when they faced hardship, for being the guardian angel she knew I had always been." The carved wooden box drew Elfrida's attention, the memory box that contained the last tangible links to Kael's humanity. She touched its surface lightly, noting the intricate craftsmanship and the way it seemed to radiate a gentle warmth. "May I?" she asked, and when he nodded, she lifted the lid with careful reverence. Inside, cushioned on faded velvet, lay a collection of objects that told the story of a mortal life. A signet ring bearing his family's coat of arms, a pressed flower from his mother's garden, a small stone that might have been a childhood treasure, and a lock of hair not his own, but his sister's, cut from her head when she took her marriage vows. "You have carried these with you for 8 centuries, Elfrida said wonderingly. "They are all I have left of who I was before," Kael replied. "Sometimes I take them out and try to remember what it felt like to be fully alive, to believe in tomorrow, to plan for a future that stretched beyond mere survival." Elfrida closed the box gently and looked up at him with new understanding. "You have been mourning not just your sister, but yourself. The man you were, the life you lost, the connections that made you feel human." "Yes," Kael said simply. "For centuries, I have been a ghost haunting my own existence." "But you are not a ghost," Elfrida said firmly. "You are a man who has endured unimaginable loss and isolation, while retaining enough compassion to care for a stranger, enough honor to regret his thoughtless words, enough hope to preserve memories that both comfort and torment you." She moved to stand before him, this remarkable woman, who saw through centuries of accumulated pain to the heart of who he remained beneath the supernatural transformation. "Your humanity was not destroyed when you became a vampire. It was preserved in these memories, in the choices you have made, in the way you still mourn what you have lost." The pendant around Kael's neck pulsed gently, responding to the deepening connection between them. In the morning light, surrounded by relics of his mortal past, he felt something shift within him, not quite healing, but the beginning of possibility. For the first time in centuries, he was not alone with his memories. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for seeing me as more than the monster I have become." "You became a monster in body only," Elfrida replied. "Your soul remained that of a man worth knowing, worth caring for, worth saving." In the guest chamber that had once housed his beloved sister, surrounded by the artifacts of his lost humanity, Kael began to believe that perhaps redemption was possible after all. As the afternoon sun slanted through the guest chamber windows, Elfrida found herself sharing stories of her own past, while Kael listened with the intensity of someone starved for human connection. She had unpacked her few belongings, practical garments worn soft with washing, her collection of medical implements, and a small bundle wrapped in oiled leather that she had not yet opened. "You mentioned losing people in the war," Kael said gently. "If it is not too painful to speak of." Elfrida smiled with the bittersweet expression of someone who had learned to carry grief without letting it crush her spirit. "Pain shared is pain lessened," my grandmother used to say, "and perhaps it is time these stories found new ears." She unwrapped the leather bundle to reveal a faded war banner, its once bright colors muted by age and weather, but its significance still clear. The banner bore the insignia of a field hospital unit, not the heraldry of noble houses, but the simple symbols that marked those who served without glory, who saved lives while others took them. I was barely 20 when the border conflicts began, Elfrida said, running her fingers over the worn fabric. Young enough to believe that healing was simply a matter of knowledge and skill, that death could always be defeated with the right treatment and enough determination. Kael settled into the chair across from her, drawn by the quiet dignity with which she spoke of memories that clearly cost her to revisit. The afternoon light caught the silver in her hair, and he found himself thinking that she wore her years like badges of honor rather than marks of defeat. The first casualty I lost was a boy named Thomas, she continued, 16 years old, wounded by an arrow that had pierced his lung. I worked on him for 6 hours, trying every technique I knew, calling on every prayer I remembered. But sometimes the body simply cannot hold the spirit, no matter how desperately we wish it otherwise. She folded the banner carefully, her movements precise despite the emotion in her voice. His mother came to collect his body. She was younger than I am now, but grief had aged her beyond her years. She thanked me for trying to save him. Thanked me, even though I had failed. You had given him a chance, Kael said quietly. That is more than many receive. That is what I told myself, Elfrida agreed. And it sustained me through the next loss and the one after that. But by the war's end, I had held too many hands as life fled, had closed too many eyes that would never open again. I began to understand that healing is not about defeating death. It is about honoring life for as long as it remains. The parallel between their experiences was not lost on either of them. Both had been forced to watch helplessly as those they cared about slipped away. Both had learned that good intentions and desperate effort could not always prevent loss. But where Kael had retreated into isolation, Elfrida had chosen to keep reaching out, to keep caring despite the inevitable pain. Tell me about the ones you saved, Kael requested, sensing that those memories might balance the weight of her losses. Elfrida's expression brightened, and she reached for another small bundle from her satchel. Inside was a collection of tokens, a child's wooden toy, a lock of hair tied with blue ribbon, a letter written in careful script, a small carving of a horse. These are from the ones who lived, she explained. Sarah, who survived a fever that should have killed her and grew up to become a teacher. Marcus, who lost his leg in battle, but learned to carve beautiful figures from wood with his hands. Elena, whose difficult birth nearly took both her and her child, but who went on to have 4 more healthy babies. She picked up each token as she spoke, and Kael could see that these memories energized her in a way that even recounting her failures had not. Where his memory box represented what he had lost, her collection celebrated what had been preserved and what had flourished despite the odds. You carry their joy as well as their pain, Kael observed. I learned that grief without gratitude becomes bitterness, Elfrida replied, but gratitude without acknowledgement of loss becomes callousness. Both are necessary, the sorrow that honors what we have lost, and the joy that celebrates what we have been privileged to witness or preserve. The pendant around Kael's neck pulsed gently as understanding passed between them. In her willingness to embrace both aspects of her experience, he saw a path he had never considered, the possibility of honoring his losses without being destroyed by them, of finding meaning in preservation rather than dwelling in regret. How do you continue? He asked. How do you keep caring when you know that loss is inevitable? Because the caring is not diminished by its temporary nature, Elfrida answered. A flower is no less beautiful for blooming only briefly. A song is no less moving for ending. Love is no less real for being mortal. She rose and moved to the window, gazing out at the forest, where afternoon shadows were beginning to lengthen. I spent many years after the war believing that protecting myself from further loss meant closing my heart to new connections. I traveled alone, healed what I could, and moved on before I could become attached to the communities I served. What changed? Kael asked, though he suspected he already knew. Loneliness, Elfrida said simply. I realized that I had become so focused on avoiding pain that I was also avoiding purpose. The healing I could provide was lessened when I held myself apart from those I treated. Understanding their lives, their fears, their hopes, that knowledge made me a better healer. She turned back to face him, and in her brown eyes he saw the same recognition that had drawn them together the night before. Sometimes the greatest risk is also the greatest opportunity. Sometimes what appears to be a trap is actually a doorway. The supernatural bond between them hummed with increasing strength, but now it felt less like magical compulsion and more like natural affinity. They were two people who had survived profound losses and learned different lessons from their pain. He had learned to protect himself through isolation. She had learned to protect others through connection. You think our binding might be such a doorway? Kael asked. I think we were both ready for something different, Elfrida replied. You with your jest about taking a mate, me with my willingness to seek shelter in a place others would fear to enter. Perhaps the magic simply responded to readiness we had not quite acknowledged in ourselves. As evening approached and the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, they sat together in comfortable silence. The war banner lay between them on the table, its faded colors, bridging their separate histories of service and sacrifice. Two people who had given much to others and received little in return had found in each other the possibility of giving and receiving in equal measure. The pendant's gentle glow seemed less like a supernatural compulsion now and more like a promise that what they were building together would honor both their losses and their hopes, both their individual strengths and their shared vulnerabilities. Outside, the night called with its ancient voice, but for the first time in centuries, Kael felt no urge to answer its solitary song. He had found something better than darkness and silence. He had found understanding. 3 days into their unusual cohabitation, Elfrida discovered the mirror of truth quite by accident. She had been exploring the castle's many chambers, while Kael tended to correspondence in his study, her natural curiosity drawing her toward the sections of the fortress that seemed most forgotten. In a tower, room that faced west toward the setting sun, she found herself standing before an ornate mirror whose surface seemed to shimmer with its own inner light. The mirror was ancient, its bronze frame carved with symbols that predated the castle itself. Unlike ordinary mirrors that simply reflected the physical world, this one seemed to peer deeper past, flesh and bone, to the desires that lived in the secret chambers of the heart. As Elfrida gazed into its depths, her reflection began to change. She saw herself not as she was a weathered woman in practical clothes, but as she wished to be. In the mirror's vision, she stood beside a tall figure whose face she could not quite see, but whose presence filled her with a warmth she had almost forgotten was possible. They were in a garden where roses bloomed despite the season, where laughter echoed off stone walls, where the loneliness that had defined so much of her adult life had been transformed into something beautiful and shared. Its seek shows truth, but not always the truth we expect to see. Elfrida turned to find Kael in the doorway, his expression careful as he watched her reaction to the mirror's revelations. He moved into the room slowly, as if approaching something that might flee if startled. "How long have you been watching?" she asked. "Long enough to see what it showed you," Kael admitted, "and to remember what it showed me when I first found it, centuries ago." "What did you see then?" Kael moved to stand beside her, and the mirror's surface rippled like disturbed water. In its depths, 2 figures appeared, the same 2 figures Elfrida had seen in her vision, but now she could see Kael's face clearly. It was his face, but transformed by something she had not yet seen in waking life. Genuine joy. "I saw myself as I was before the curse," Kael said quietly. "Young, mortal, with all of life's possibilities stretching before me, but lately, when I look into its depths..." The mirror shimmered again. And this time it showed them as they were now not young, not transformed by magic or wishful thinking, but exactly as they stood in that moment. Yet somehow, in the mirror's version of reality, they appeared complete in a way that neither had felt while alone. "It shows us the truth we are afraid to acknowledge," Elfrida said softly. "That we want this," Kael agreed, "that we want each other, despite the impossibility of our circumstances." The admission hung between them like a bridge half-built, waiting for one of them to take the final step that would make crossing possible. Elfrida turned away from the mirror to look directly at Kael, studying the way afternoon light played across his features, the way uncertainty and longing warred in his storm-grey eyes. "I have not wanted anyone in 20 years, she said. "Not since the war took my betrothed, and I decided that love was a luxury I could not afford." "I have not wanted anyone in 8 centuries, Kael replied. "Not since. I became something that could never offer a woman anything but danger and darkness. And yet here we are," Elfrida said, moving closer to him. "Two people who swore off love, bound by supernatural forces, to confront exactly what we thought we had left behind." The space between them felt charged with possibility and fear in equal measure. Kael reached out slowly, his fingers barely brushing the back of her hand. Even that small contact sent warmth spiraling through both of them, the supernatural bond amplifying what would have been attraction under any circumstances. "I could hurt you," Kael said, though he did not pull away. "Not intentionally, but my nature." "Could hurt me less than my own nature has done," Elfrida interrupted gently. "I have hurt myself for decades by choosing safety over connection, by traveling through life as if it were something to be endured rather than experienced." She turned her hand palm up, allowing their fingers to intertwine. The contact was simple, innocent, and yet it felt more intimate than encounters she had shared with men in her youth. Perhaps it was the honesty of their situation, two people who had nothing left to lose, and therefore nothing left to hide behind. "The mirror shows us what we want," Kael said, his thumb tracing gentle patterns across her knuckles. "But wanting and having are different things. The practical difficulties can be solved by practical people," Elfrida finished. "I am not a young girl who believes love conquers all through sentiment alone. I am a woman who has learned that love conquers all through choice, effort, and the willingness to adapt to circumstances beyond our control." Kael lifted their joined hands and pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles, a gesture both courtly and intimate that spoke of the man he had been raised to be. Centuries before. "You would truly choose this? Choose me despite what I am?" "I would choose us," Elfrida corrected. "Choose what we might become, together, despite what we have been apart." The mirror behind them pulsed with soft light, as if blessing their acknowledgement of what it had shown them. In its depths, the garden vision returned, but clearer now, more detailed. They could see themselves working side by side, she tending both plants and people, he protecting what they had built together. It was not a fairy tale romance of eternal youth and beauty, but something richer, a partnership built on mutual respect, shared purpose, and the mature understanding that love deepened rather than diminished with time. "I have forgotten how to hope for happiness," Kael said wonderingly. "Then we shall have to remember together," Elfrida replied, stepping closer until she could feel the warmth of his breath against her cheek. "One day, one choice, one moment of courage at a time." When he kissed her, it was with the reverence of someone who had not expected to experience tenderness again. She kissed him back, with the confidence of someone who had finally decided to trust in possibilities she had thought beyond her reach. The mirror's light seemed to envelop them, blessing their choice to believe in what they could build together, rather than what they had lost apart. The supernatural bond between them flared not with magical compulsion, but with recognition. Two souls finally acknowledging that they had found exactly what they needed in each other. Outside the tower window, the sun set in shades of gold and crimson, painting their first kiss with the promise of all the sunsets they might witness together. In the mirror's depths, the garden bloomed eternal, waiting for them to make it real. The following morning brought an unexpected test of their newfound intimacy. Elfrida woke to find a silver cross lying on the table beside her bed, its surface polished to mirror brightness and radiating a gentle warmth that seemed almost alive. She had not placed it there, and its sudden appearance filled her with both curiosity and concern. She found Kael in the castle's chapel, a small chamber that had clearly not been used for worship in many years. Dust covered the simple wooden pews, and spiderwebs draped the corners like abandoned prayers. But at the altar, someone had placed fresh candles, and their light revealed faded frescoes that depicted scenes of redemption and forgiveness. "You brought the cross," Elfrida said, though it was not quite a question. Kael stood with his back to her, his shoulders tense with expectation. "I found it among my family's possessions. It was blessed by the bishop who married my parents, carried by my mother through all her trials, worn by my sister at her wedding." His voice carried a mixture of hope and dread. "I wanted to know if what we felt last night could survive the test of sacred things." Elfrida moved closer, the silver cross warm in her palm. Throughout her travels, she had seen enough of magic and faith to know that blessed objects often revealed truths that ordinary sight could not detect. If Kael's curse was strong enough, the cross might burn him, or cause him pain, or prove that their growing love was nothing more than supernatural delusion. "Are you prepared for what it might show us?" she asked. "I am prepared for disappointment," Kael replied. "I am not prepared for hope." Elfrida reached the altar and extended the cross toward him. For a moment that stretched like eternity, they both held their breath. Then Kael turned and took the cross from her hands without flinching, without pain, without any sign that the blessed silver was anything more than metal warmed by her touch. The cross lay peacefully in his palm, its holy radiance undiminished but no longer threatening. If anything, it seemed to glow more brightly in his hands, as if his touch had awakened rather than corrupted its sacred nature. "I don't understand," Kael whispered, staring at the cross as if it might vanish like a mirage. "Perhaps your curse is not as absolute as you believed," Elfrida suggested gently. "Or perhaps love truly does change the fundamental nature of things." They spent the morning testing other sacred objects that Kael had hidden away over the centuries, a rosary that had belonged to his grandmother, a small Bible written in Latin, a vial of water from a holy spring. None of them caused him harm or discomfort. Instead, they seemed to recognize something in him that even he had not known existed, the possibility of redemption. "I thought I was irredeemably damned," Kael said as they sat together in the chapel's front pew, the collection of sacred objects arranged on the altar before them. "For 8 centuries, I believed that my transformation had severed me permanently from any hope of grace. Perhaps damnation and redemption are not permanent states," Elfrida mused. "Perhaps they are choices we make each day, with each action, each thought, each connection we allow ourselves to form." The afternoon found them walking in what had once been the castle's garden. Years of neglect had allowed wild growth to reclaim the formal beds, but beneath the tangle of vines and weeds, the bones of something beautiful remained. Together, they began to clear a small section near the chapel wall, working side by side to uncover what had been lost to time and abandonment. "My mother planted these roses," Kael said, carefully pruning dead wood from what might once have been a prize specimen. "She said gardens were acts of faith planting today, for beauty you might not live to see fully bloom." "Then this is fitting work for us," Elfrida replied, her own hands busy with the weeds that choked a patch of what appeared to be herb plants. Two people learning to believe in tomorrows again. As they worked, they shared stories of their lives with an intimacy that felt both natural and revolutionary. Kael spoke of his mortal childhood, of lessons in swordplay and statecraft, of the day he had planned to propose marriage to a young woman whose name he could barely remember now. Elfrida described her apprenticeship with the village healer who had raised her after her parents died, her first tentative attempts at setting bones and brewing medicines, the gradual realization that her hands had been made for mending what was broken. "We are both healers in our way," Kael observed as the sun began to sink toward the western mountains. "You heal bodies. I have learned to heal the damage my kind can cause, protecting villages from others like me, ensuring that my own feeding causes minimal harm." "And now we might heal each other," Elfrida said, pausing in her work to look at him directly. "Not by changing what we are, but by accepting what we might become together." That evening, as they shared a simple meal by the fire, the supernatural bond between them felt less like magical compulsion and more like natural partnership. They moved around each other with increasing comfort, anticipating needs, sharing tasks, creating the small rituals that transformed a house into a home. But their peaceful domesticity was interrupted by the sound of distant bells, not the castle's ancient warning bell, but the rapid pealing that signaled urgent messages traveling through the mountain communities. "Trouble," Kael said, his entire demeanor shifting from relaxed companion to vigilant protector. "The bells carry news of danger." They climbed to the castle's highest tower, where an ancient telescope allowed them to survey the valleys below. In the distance, Elfrida could see smoke rising from what appeared to be a burning village, and even at this distance, shapes moved against the firelight that suggested violence and chaos. "Other vampires," Kael said grimly, his enhanced vision revealing details that remained hidden from her mortal eyes. "A hunting party, feeding without restraint or consideration for the damage they cause." "Your responsibility?" Elfrida asked, though she already knew the answer from the tension radiating through his frame. "My territory, my people to protect," Kael confirmed. "I cannot allow this to continue but leaving you here alone." "Then I will come with you," Elfrida said simply. "Two healers working together, each contributing what they do best." The cross in her pocket seemed to pulse with warmth, as if blessing their decision to face danger together rather than apart. Below them, the garden they had begun to restore caught the last rays of sunlight, a symbol of what they were building and what they had committed to protect. Love, it seemed, was not just about finding peace together. It was about choosing to fight for that peace when it came under threat. The journey to the burning village revealed horrors that tested even Elfrida's battle-hardened composure. Bodies lay scattered through the streets like discarded dolls, drained of blood and life. Houses smoldered in the aftermath of supernatural fury, their wooden beams twisted into impossible shapes by forces that defied natural law. But it was not the carnage itself that chilled her, it was the deliberate precision of it, the way the destruction followed patterns that spoke of ritual rather than random feeding. "This was not hunger," Kael said as they moved through the devastation, his voice heavy with a recognition that filled Elfrida with dread. "This was a message." In the village square, they found the source of that message, a crown of black stone set with gems the color of dried blood, its surface crawling with symbols that seemed to shift and writhe when viewed directly. The cursed bloodstone crown radiated malevolent power, and around it, carved into the cobblestones themselves, was a circle of ancient runes. "The crown of first blood," Kael whispered, and for the first time since she had known him, Elfrida heard genuine terror in his voice. "I had hoped it was lost forever." "What is it?" she asked, though every instinct screamed at her to flee from the artifact's presence. Kael moved closer to the crown, careful not to step within the circle of runes. "It is the source of all vampire curses in this realm, the instrument of my own transformation, and the means by which every other vampire in these lands came to be what they are." The implications hit Elfrida like a physical blow. "You were not just transformed into a vampire. You were the first. You created all the others. Not by choice, Kael said quickly, seeing the shock in her eyes. I was a young lord, foolish and proud, who sought power to protect my lands from invading armies. A sorcerer offered me strength beyond mortal limits, and I was desperate enough to accept. But the curse spread like a plague. Everyone I fed from, everyone who died by my hand, rose again with the same hunger, the same terrible need. Elfrida struggled to process this revelation. The man she had come to care for, whose gentle nature had won her heart, was responsible for creating every vampire that had ever terrorized the innocent in these mountains. How many? Dozens at first, Kael admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Then hundreds, as they created others in turn. I spent the first century of my existence trying to undo what I had done, hunting down the worst of my progeny, establishing rules and territories to limit the damage. But the curse had taken on a life of its own. The crown pulsed with dark energy, and Elfrida realized with growing horror why it had been left here for them to find. They want to use it again. The vampires who did this, they want to strengthen the curse. Or break it entirely, Kael said, his expression grim with understanding. The crown's power works both ways. In the right hands, with the right ritual, it could free every vampire in the realm from their curse, restore them to mortality. But the process would require a willing sacrifice, Elfrida finished, the pieces falling into terrible place, the original source. You. A slow clap echoed through the empty square, and they turned to see figures emerging from the shadows of the ruined buildings. Vampires, all of them. But these bore the unmistakable marks of great age and power. Their leader was a woman whose beauty had been preserved at the moment of transformation, but whose eyes held the accumulated malice of centuries. How touching, the woman said, her voice carrying the cultured accent of forgotten nobility. The great Kael Shadowmere, architect of our glorious curse, finally ready to face the consequences of his youthful ambition. Seraphina, Kael said, and Elfrida heard both recognition and regret in his voice. I had hoped you were truly dead. Dead? Seraphina laughed, a sound like breaking glass. Why would I wish to die when immortality suits me so well? I have spent the last 3 centuries gathering our scattered kindred, building an army of those who embrace what we are, rather than lamenting what we have lost. More vampires materialized from the ruins, a dozen, then 2 dozen, their eyes gleaming with predatory hunger. But Elfrida noticed something else in their expressions: desperation. These were creatures who had grown tired of their existence, who sought either ultimate power or final release. You want to use the crown, Kael said, but not to break the curse, to strengthen it. To complete it, Seraphina corrected. The ritual that created us was interrupted before its full power could manifest. With your willing participation, we can become something beyond mere vampires. Gods of the night, sustained not by blood, but by the very life force of the realm itself. And if I refuse? Seraphina's gaze shifted to Elfrida, and her smile became something terrible to behold. Then your little mortal pays the price for your selfishness. We know about your touching bond, about the way her presence has somehow allowed you to touch sacred things without burning. Fascinating, really. We shall enjoy experimenting with her before we drain her dry. The threat to Elfrida galvanized something primal in Kael's nature. Power radiated from him like heat from a forge, and for a moment Elfrida glimpsed what he might have been like in his early years as a vampire, before guilt and self-loathing had taught him restraint. You will not touch her, he said, his voice carrying the authority of one who had ruled these mountains for 8 centuries. Then you will submit to the ritual, Seraphina replied. Willingly, or we will take what we need by force and make you watch her suffer first. Elfrida's mind raced through possibilities, her healer's training automatically seeking solutions to seemingly impossible problems. The crown's power was vast, but every artifact had limitations, weaknesses that could be exploited. And there was something about the ritual circle that nagged at her. The runes were carved in a specific pattern, following rules that suggested. "The ritual requires not just your participation," she said suddenly, the realization hitting her with the force of revelation. "It requires your death." They need to drain the original source completely to redistribute the power among themselves. Kael's eyes widened as he understood the full scope of Seraphina's plan. A willing sacrifice grants them control over all vampires in the realm. My death would either free everyone from the curse or bind them permanently to these creatures' will. "Choose quickly, Ancient One," Seraphina said, her patience clearly wearing thin. "The blood moon rises again in 3 nights, and the ritual must be completed during its peak. Agree to our terms, and your beloved healer lives to see the dawn. Refuse." She gestured, and her followers began to circle closer, their movements predatory and precise. Elfrida could see in their eyes the hunger of creatures who had been denied proper feeding for too long, who saw her as both leverage against Kael and a potential source of sustenance. "I need time to consider," Kael said carefully. "You have until tomorrow night," Seraphina agreed. "Return here with your decision, or we will come to collect you both. And Kael, do not attempt to flee these mountains. We have been very thorough in our preparations." The vampires melted back into the shadows as suddenly as they had appeared, leaving Kael and Elfrida alone with the crown and the terrible weight of an impossible choice. Save the woman he loved by condemning every vampire in the realm to permanent enslavement, or refuse and watch her die before suffering the same fate himself. "There has to be another way," Elfrida said firmly, her voice cutting through his despair. "Every problem has multiple solutions. We simply need to find the one they have not anticipated." Kael looked down at her with something approaching wonder. "Even now, faced with this, you speak of hope." "I speak of determination," Elfrida corrected. "We have one day to discover what they do not know about their own ritual, one day to turn their trap against them. And I suggest we begin by learning everything we can about that crown and the power it truly holds." In the distance, thunder rolled across the mountains, and the first drops of rain began to fall on the blood-soaked village. But in the growing darkness, 2 figures bent over an ancient artifact, seeking the knowledge that might yet save them all. The return journey to Castle Ravencrest passed in tense silence, both Kael and Elfrida lost in their own thoughts as they grappled with the magnitude of the choice before them. The cursed crown remained in the ruined village, but its malevolent presence seemed to follow them through the dark forest, a constant reminder of the impossible deadline they faced. Back in the castle's library, surrounded by centuries of accumulated knowledge, they began their desperate search for answers. Ancient tomes, filled with vampire lore, covered every available surface, their pages yellowed with age and fragile as autumn leaves. Elfrida's medical training proved invaluable as she approached the supernatural texts with the same methodical precision she brought to diagnosing difficult ailments. "Here," she said, her finger tracing a passage written in archaic Latin. "This text speaks of the original binding ritual. It mentions a counterpart, something called the healing crystal of life." Kael looked up from his own research, hope flickering in his storm-grey eyes. "I know that crystal. My family's chapel once housed it, before the curse. It was said to channel pure life force, to heal wounds that seemed beyond mortal remedy." "Where is it now?" Elfrida asked, though she suspected the answer would not be simple. "Hidden," Kael replied. "When I realized what I had become, I secreted it away in the deepest vaults beneath the castle. I feared that my cursed nature might corrupt it, turn a tool of healing into something dark." They descended into the castle's foundations, past levels of construction that spoke of different ages, different purposes. The modern castle was built upon medieval foundations, which in turn rested on Roman stonework that had been laid over even more ancient structures. The air grew colder as they went deeper, and their torches cast dancing shadows that seemed to whisper of secrets buried in stone and darkness. The vault lay behind a door that bore both physical locks and mystical wards. Kael's hands shook slightly as he worked the intricate mechanisms, speaking words in a language so old that it predated written history. When the door finally swung open, a gentle light spilled out, not the harsh glare of magical artifacts under stress, but the warm, golden radiance of something fundamentally good. The healing crystal of life rested on a simple stone pedestal, its surface clear as mountain water, but shot through with veins of light that pulsed in rhythm with their heartbeats. Around it, the vault's walls were covered with protective symbols that had kept the crystal pure through 8 centuries of darkness. "It's beautiful," Elfrida breathed, moving closer to the artifact. She could feel its power like sunshine on her skin, warm and life-affirming in a way that made her realize how much shadow they had been living under. "And potentially dangerous," Kael warned, "if I touch it in my cursed state." "Then perhaps it's time to test whether your state has truly changed," Elfrida suggested. She thought of the silver cross that had not burned him, the sacred objects that had accepted his touch. "The bond between us has already altered fundamental laws. Perhaps it has altered this as well." Together, they reached for the crystal. Kael's fingers brushed the artifact first, and instead of the violent reaction they had both feared, the crystal's light simply intensified, wrapping around his hand like a benediction. When Elfrida added her touch, the radiance doubled, and suddenly the vault was filled with visions. They saw the night of Kael's transformation, but from a perspective neither had expected that of the crystal itself. The artifact had been present during the original ritual, its power meant to balance the crown's corruption and create vampires who retained their humanity. But the ritual had been interrupted before the crystal could complete its work, leaving the curse incomplete and unstable. "That's why you're different," Elfrida realized. "Why you retained your conscience and capacity for love, while others became pure predators." The crystal's influence was partially successful, even though the ritual was flawed. More visions followed, possible futures that branched out from this moment, like streams flowing from a mountain spring. They saw themselves completing the original ritual correctly, using both crown and crystal to give every vampire in the realm a choice. Remain cursed, but retain their enhanced abilities, or return to mortality with their memories intact. "It would not be simple," Kael said as the visions faded. "The ritual would require perfect timing, absolute precision, and both of us working in harmony. One mistake would doom everyone, ourselves included," Elfrida finished. "But succeeding would free every vampire to choose their own fate. No more slaves to hunger, no more prisoners of Seraphina's ambition." They spent the remaining hours until dawn planning their strategy. The ritual required specific conditions, the peak of the blood moon, a circle of power that could contain both artifacts simultaneously, and the willing participation of the original source. But unlike Seraphina's version, which demanded Kael's death, their approach would channel the crown's power through the crystal's healing influence, transforming rather than destroying. "Seraphina expects us to return to the village," Kael said as they reviewed their preparations. "She will be waiting with her entire force. Then we give her what she expects," Elfrida replied, "but not in the way she anticipates." The day passed in careful preparation. Elfrida gathered supplies from her medical kit and the castle's stores, herbs for focusing the mind, salts for purifying sacred spaces, oils for anointing the artifacts. Kael retrieved armor from his family's armory, not the heavy plate of a medieval knight, but the flexible chain mail that would allow for movement while providing protection. As evening approached, they stood together in the castle's chapel, surrounded by the sacred objects that had accepted Kael's transformed nature. The atmosphere was charged with possibility and danger in equal measure. "Are you afraid?" Elfrida asked, as she helped him don the armor. "Terrified," Kael admitted. "Not of death. I have lived long enough to make peace with mortality. But of failing you, of watching you suffer because of choices I made centuries before we met." Elfrida fastened the last buckle and looked up into his eyes. "Then let us make new choices together, better choices, informed by wisdom we have gained through our separate sorrows and our shared hope." They kissed then, not with the desperate passion of lovers facing their last night together, but with the steady certainty of partners who had committed to a common cause. The crystal in Kael's hands pulsed with warm light, as if blessing their union of purpose. "Whatever happens tonight," Elfrida said, "I want you to know that these days with you have been the happiest of my adult life. Not because they were without struggle or fear, but because they were filled with the possibility of building something meaningful together." "You have given me back my humanity," Kael replied. "Not by changing what I am, but by showing me that what I am can coexist with love, purpose, and hope. For that gift alone, the risk we take tonight is worthwhile." As the blood moon began to rise, casting its crimson light through the chapel windows, they gathered the materials they would need for the confrontation ahead. The crystal went into a specially prepared pouch that would protect it during travel. Weapons joined their supplies, not just Kael's supernatural abilities, but mortal steel blessed by sacred words and human determination. "Remember," Elfrida said as they prepared to leave the castle's protective walls, "our goal is not to fight Seraphina's army, but to transform the very nature of their existence. We succeed not through violence, but through offering them a choice they never knew they had." The night air was crisp and clear as they made their way through the forest toward the ruined village. Above them, the blood moon climbed steadily toward its zenith, and with each step they could feel the weight of destiny settling around their shoulders like a mantle. Behind them, Castle Ravencrest stood silhouetted against the starlit sky, its windows glowing with warm light that promised sanctuary and home. Whatever the outcome of the night ahead, they had already succeeded in the most important task of all. They had found in each other the courage to hope for a future worth fighting for. The village lay ahead, shrouded in supernatural darkness and waiting for their return. But they walked toward that darkness not as victims approaching their doom, but as healers, bringing the possibility of redemption to those who had forgotten such a thing was possible. In the distance, thunder rumbled across the mountains, not from any natural storm, but from the gathering of powers that would soon collide in a contest for the souls of an entire supernatural species. The final confrontation was about to begin. The ruined village square had been transformed into something from a nightmare. Seraphina's followers had arranged themselves in concentric circles around the cursed bloodstone crown, their eyes reflecting the artifact's malevolent glow like mirrors of hunger. At the center of it all stood Seraphina herself, no longer bothering to maintain the facade of civilized discourse. Her true nature was on full display, a predator, ancient and terrible, sustained by centuries of cruelty. "How punctual," she called as Kael, and Elfrida emerged from the forest shadows. "I do appreciate reliability in my victims." Kael stepped forward, the healing crystal of life concealed beneath his cloak, but already radiating its gentle warmth. "We have come to accept your terms." "Excellent." Seraphina's smile revealed fangs like ivory daggers. "Then you will kneel before the crown and submit to the ritual willingly. Your death will grant us dominion over every vampire in the realm, and your little healer will serve as entertainment for my followers." "I think not," Elfrida said quietly, and her calm voice carried across the square with startling authority. From within her medical satchel, she drew an object that made several vampires hiss and recoil: the phoenix. feather quill, its surface shimmering with otherworldly fire. The quill was legendary, even among supernatural artifacts, a writing instrument capable of rewriting the fundamental laws that governed magic itself. Its appearance here, in the hands of a mortal healer, sent ripples of uncertainty through Seraphina's carefully orchestrated gathering. "Impossible," Seraphina breathed. "That was lost centuries ago." "Hidden," Elfrida corrected. "Waiting for someone who understood that the most powerful magic is not that which destroys, but that which transforms." She raised the quill, and its fire cast dancing shadows across the vampire assembly. "We offer you a choice, all of you. Not servitude to Seraphina's ambition, but freedom to choose your own nature." Kael stepped beside her and revealed the crystal, its life-giving radiance creating a stark contrast to the crown's dark power. The original ritual was incomplete. Tonight, we finish what was begun 8 centuries ago, not to strengthen the curse, but to give it balance. "You cannot rewrite vampire law," Seraphina snarled, but there was uncertainty in her voice now. "The curse is absolute." "No law is absolute when love challenges it," Elfrida replied, and as she spoke, the quill burst into brilliant flame that did not consume but illuminated. Words began to write themselves in the air, golden letters that hung like stars against the crimson moon. "I call upon the power that binds all things, that heals all wounds, that offers redemption to any soul willing to accept it." The vampires around them began to change, not in form, but in expression. For the first time in centuries, some of them remembered what it felt like to hope. The youngest among them, those who retained fragments of their original humanity, stepped back from Seraphina's circle and toward the light emanating from Kael and Elfrida. "Fools!" Seraphina raged. "You would give up immortality for the weakness of mortal feeling? We would." "Choose," said one of the younger vampires, a woman whose face still held echoes of the beauty she had possessed in life. "For the first time since our transformation, we would choose our own path." The battle began, not with physical violence, but with a clash of supernatural forces. Seraphina raised her hands and called upon the crown's power, sending waves of dark energy toward Kael and Elfrida. But the crystal in Kael's hands flared in response, and the quill in Elfrida's transformed the attacking magic into something else entirely, a test of will rather than strength. Around the square, vampires found themselves pulled between opposing forces. Those who embraced their predatory nature were drawn towards Seraphina and the crown's promise of ultimate power. But others, those who had spent their immortal years regretting what they had become, moved toward the healing light that promised not destruction, but choice. "You cannot win," Seraphina declared, pouring more power into her. "Assault. I have had centuries to master the crown's abilities, but you have never understood its true nature," Kael replied. And for the first time since the confrontation began, he allowed his own supernatural abilities to manifest. 8 centuries of accumulated power flowed through him, but tempered now by love and guided by the crystal's healing influence. The crown was never meant to enslave. It was meant to test. The golden words written by the phoenix quill began to circle the square, creating a barrier of transformed law that separated those who chose redemption from those who clung to damnation. Within that barrier, the air itself seemed to shimmer with possibility. "The ritual requires willing participation," Elfrida called out to the assembled vampires. "Not submission to another's will, but the conscious choice to transform yourselves. Who among you is brave enough to choose humanity over hunger?" More vampires stepped forward, their faces shining with tears they had not shed since their transformation. But Seraphina was not finished. With a scream of rage that shattered windows in the abandoned buildings around them, she called upon the full power of the crown. The bloodstone artifact rose into the air, its malevolent radiance threatening to eclipse both crystal and quill. The true battle was about to begin. The cursed bloodstone crown's ascent into the crimson sky triggered a transformation in the very fabric of reality around them. The air crackled with opposing energies as two fundamental forces, creation and destruction, healing and corruption, prepared to clash with the fate of an entire supernatural species hanging in the balance. From the shadows at the edge of the square, a new artifact materialized. The Unity Chalice, ancient beyond measure, and glowing with soft silver radiance. It appeared not through Seraphina's dark magic, or even through Kael and Elfrida's combined will, but as if summoned by the universe itself to witness and sanctify what was about to unfold. "The Chalice of Souls," Kael breathed, recognizing the artifact from legends older than his own transformation. "It appears only when the fundamental nature of existence hangs in balance." The chalice floated between the crown's darkness and the crystal's light, its surface reflecting not their physical forms, but the essence of their souls. In its depths, all present could see the truth of what they were choosing. Seraphina's path led to godlike power, but complete separation from humanity, while Kael and Elfrida's offered a bridge between mortal and immortal existence. "You think to bind us with sentiment and weakness," Seraphina snarled, but her voice carried a note of desperation now. Around her, the circle of loyal followers was shrinking as more vampires were drawn toward the possibility of redemption. "We offer you wholeness," Elfrida replied, raising the phoenix quill higher. The golden words it had written now formed a complete circle around the square, and within that boundary, a new kind of magic was taking hold. The choice to be both powerful and compassionate, immortal yet connected to the world of the living. The chalice pulsed brighter, and suddenly its purpose became clear. This was not merely a vessel for symbolic gestures, it was a literal bridge between states of being, capable of allowing conscious transformation rather than forced change. "The ritual has 3 paths," Kael announced, understanding flooding through him as the chalice's ancient wisdom touched his mind. "Those who choose can return to full mortality, retaining memories but regaining human limitations. Others may retain their immortality while reclaiming their humanity, and those who prefer their current existence may remain unchanged, but freed from the compulsions of hunger and predation." "Impossible," Seraphina raged. But even as she spoke, several of her closest followers were stepping away from her circle. The promise of choice, real choice, freely made, was proving more powerful than centuries of enforced loyalty. The crown above them pulsed with increasing fury, its dark energy reaching toward the blood moon as if drawing power from the celestial alignment. But the chalice rose to meet it, and when the 2 artifacts touched, the reaction was unlike anything any of them had ever witnessed. Instead of explosion or destruction, the contact created a moment of perfect silence. In that crystalline instant, every vampire in the square felt the weight of their curse lift, just enough to remember what it had been like to be human. Not the weakness or frailty they had been taught to despise, but the capacity for growth, for change, for connection that transcended mere survival. "Choose now," Elfrida called out, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent decades helping others face life-altering decisions. "Not out of fear or hunger or ancient grudges, but from the fullness of your hearts." One by one, the vampires began to move toward the chalice. Some came tentatively, others with desperate hunger for redemption they had thought forever lost. Each who touched the artifact's surface was enveloped in light that revealed their deepest nature and deepest desires. The young woman who had first broken ranks chose mortality, her vampire strength flowing out of her like water as her human warmth returned. An elderly vampire, who had retained his scholarly nature throughout centuries of curse, chose the middle path, keeping his immortality but regaining his capacity for genuine human emotion. Others made different choices, but all chose freely, without coercion or manipulation. "You cannot take them all," Serafina snarled at Elfrida, her perfect features distorted by rage and disbelief. "Some will always choose the darkness. And that is their right," Elfrida replied calmly. "Choice means nothing if only one option is truly available." Indeed, a handful of vampires remained with Serafina, those who had embraced their predatory nature so completely that they could not imagine existence any other way. The chalice did not reject them or force transformation upon them. Instead, it simply removed the compulsive aspects of their hunger, leaving them with supernatural abilities, but freeing them from the desperate need that had driven so many to cruelty. The crown's power, robbed of unwilling subjects to control, began to fade. The bloodstone artifact settled back to the ground, its malevolent radiance dimming to a mere echo of its former menace. Without a population of enslaved vampires to command, Serafina's bid for godhood crumbled like a sandcastle touched by the tide. "This is not over," she vowed, gathering her remaining followers around her. "You have robbed us of an empire, but you have not destroyed us." "We never intended to destroy you," Kael said gently. "We intended to free you. What you do with that freedom is now your choice to make." As Serafina and her loyalists melted back into the shadows, the chalice began to fade, its work complete. But before it vanished entirely, it pulsed once more, and both Kael and Elfrida felt a profound change settle into their bones. The supernatural bond between them, forged by magic and strengthened by love, had transformed into something new, a partnership that transcended the boundaries between mortal and immortal, a union that honored both their natures while limiting neither. The blood moon was setting, and with its descent, a new age was beginning. 6 months after the night that changed everything, the first roses bloomed in the castle garden. Elfrida knelt among the newly planted beds, her hands dark with soil and her face bright with satisfaction as she tended the new beginning rose, a flower that had appeared spontaneously in the exact spot where she and Kael had shared their first kiss. The bloom was unlike any variety she had ever seen. Its petals shifted, color with the light, from deep crimson at dawn to pure gold at noon to gentle silver under the stars. The garden had become a symbol of their transformed life together. Where once there had been only wild growth and abandonment, careful tending had revealed the bones of something beautiful. Herb beds flourished alongside ornamental flowers, creating a space that was both practical and lovely. Patients from the surrounding villages often remarked that simply walking through the garden seemed to accelerate their healing, though Elfrida suspected that had more to do with the peace the place radiated than any supernatural properties. "The morning appointments are ready for you," Kael said, emerging from the castle with a steaming mug of tea prepared exactly the way she preferred. The sight of him still made her pulse quicken, but now it was the steady warmth of deep affection rather than the desperate intensity of new love. He had changed since that night in the village square, though. Not in ways that a casual observer would notice. He remained vampire in nature, still required blood for sustenance, still possessed supernatural strength and speed, still bore the marks of his ancient curse. But the Unity Chalice had done its work well. The compulsive hunger that had driven him for 8 centuries had been replaced by conscious choice. He fed only when necessary, only from willing donors who understood exactly what they offered, and he did so without the shame and self-loathing that had poisoned his existence for so long. More importantly, he had rediscovered his capacity for hope. The man who had made a jest about taking a mate had become someone who woke each morning excited to see what the day might bring. "Mrs. Henderson's rheumatism again?" Elfrida asked, accepting the tea gratefully. "Among others. Young Timothy's broken arm is healing well, and Maria wants to discuss herbs for her garden. But I think you'll be most interested in our newest patient, Kael's." The expression held the particular satisfaction he wore when he had managed a successful surprise. Elfrida raised an eyebrow but said nothing, following him through the garden gate and toward the castle's east wing, which they had converted into a proper healing center. The great hall still served as their main living space, but the former guest chambers now housed examination rooms, a surgery for more serious cases, and a dispensary where Elfrida prepared the medications that had made her famous throughout the mountain communities. Their new patient waited in the main consultation room, and Elfrida's breath caught when she recognized her. Elena, one of the vampires who had chosen the middle path during that night of transformation, sat nervously in the chair beside the window. She appeared as she had in life, perhaps 30 years old, with dark hair and intelligent eyes. But now those eyes held hope instead of hunger. "I heard you were helping people," Elena said softly. "Both. People like them," she gestured toward the village below, "and people like me." It was true. Word had spread through the supernatural community about the healer who treated all conditions, mortal and immortal alike. Transformed vampires came seeking guidance on how to navigate their new existence. Those who had chosen full mortality needed help adjusting to human limitations they had forgotten. Even a few who had remained unchanged sought counsel on how to live with their nature while honoring the new freedoms the ritual had granted. "What can I do for you?" Elfrida asked, settling into her own chair with the comfortable authority of someone who had found her true calling. "I want to have a child," Elena said, and the longing in her voice was unmistakable. "I know it should be impossible. I'm still immortal, still not fully human. But I hoped. I wondered if perhaps—" Elfrida exchanged glances with Kael, who had positioned himself near the door in case Elena needed space. To speak freely. This was not the first such request they had received. The transformation had restored many things to the former vampires, but the question of whether it had restored fertility remained unanswered. "We can certainly explore the possibilities," Elfrida said carefully. "The magic that changed you was unlike anything previously recorded. There may be options available that we have not yet discovered." They spent the morning examining Elena and discussing the complex magical and biological questions her request raised. It was challenging work, the intersection of supernatural transformation and mortal medicine, but exactly the kind of problem that energized both Elfrida and Kael. As Elena left with a supply of herbs that might help regulate the hormonal cycles that vampirism had disrupted, Elfrida found herself thinking about the future with renewed wonder. The work they were doing here had implications that stretched far beyond their mountain realm. They were pioneering an entirely new field of healing, one that bridged the gap between mortal medicine and supernatural transformation. That evening, as they sat together in the garden watching the sun set behind the peaks, Elfrida voiced the thought that had been growing in her mind for weeks. "We should document this work," she said. "Create a formal record of what we're learning, establish protocols that other healers could follow. There must be transformed vampires in other realms, other places where our experience could help." Kael considered this, absently plucking a dead bloom from the new beginning rose. "You're thinking of leaving here? Of traveling again?" "I'm thinking of expanding here," Elfrida corrected. "Creating a place where others could come to learn, to study, to train in this new kind of healing. Not just a treatment center, but a school." The idea took root between them like a seed finding fertile soil. They could see it clearly. Scholars and healers from across the Spinrones. Known world, coming to study the intersection of magic and medicine. Students learning to treat conditions that had never before been addressed. A library that collected knowledge about transformation and redemption from every available source. The Academy of Healing Arts, Kael mused. Open to all who seek to learn, regardless of their nature or origin. With you as my partner in all of it, Elfrida added, reaching for his hand. Not just as a source of supernatural knowledge, but as an equal in the work of helping others. The new beginning rose seemed to pulse with gentle light, as if blessing their vision. Around them, the garden hummed with evening sounds, bees visiting late-blooming flowers, birds settling into their nests, the distant laughter of children from the village below. It was not the ending either of them had expected when a storm had driven a weary healer to seek shelter in a cursed castle. But it was the ending they had chosen together, built through shared work and mutual respect, and the kind of deep love that grew stronger with each passing day. Above them, the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, and somewhere in the distance a bell tolled, not in warning this time, but in celebration of all that had been transformed and all that was yet to come.